Doug, we should have shipped you something.
I know. Yeah, somebody actually did that once. They had pizza ordered and it arrived at my front door.
No.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That would have been
Penn
great.
State did that.
Oh,
You know
Brilliant.
what? That was during COVID, so
ah, okay. All right. It looks like the PB likes your guys' computers more than mine.
Oh, good. You're on big screen.
Yeah, she's pulling it up here.
Excellent. All right. So anyway, it's 4 o'clock. Welcome everyone to the biology seminar series. I don't want to take up any time here except to say, grad students, please don't forget to check in via Canvas. And at this point, I'm going to hand this over to Dennis Conover.
Okay, thanks, Eric.
Mhm.
Well, I'm very happy to welcome Doug to our seminar series at the University of Cincinnati. Um, Doug, through his scientific publications and his several books, he's really opened up our eyes to the importance of growing native plants in our yards. And those native plants, of course, are providing food for the native insects, which are providing food for birds and other animals. And I think people are really listening to Doug because I'm seeing more and more native plants showing up in people's yards. I'm seeing more and more oak trees popping up in people's front yards. And I'm seeing more native plant nurseries and ecological landscaping companies getting started. So without further ado, I'm just going to say, here's Doug and let him get started.
all right. Thanks, Dennis. Of course, I agree. A lot of that is happening. I'm seeing the needle move, but we still have a serious issue with invasive plants, plants that have left our gardens. They're in our natural areas. They're covering millions of acres. And believe it or not, what we should do about that has been controversial for a long time, decades at this point. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to ask the question, are alien plants bad? But I can tell you, I've gotten pushback from using the term alien because a lot of people think it's pejorative. It conjures up nasty images. So they suggest I should use the word exotic, but to me that goes in the other direction. I always think of exotic belly dancers or something, and I don't think the plants are fitting that definition. They're not striking or fascinating or strangely beautiful, enticing. Out of towners has been suggested, and it's true. They're all from out of town or introduced. And I'm going to stick with introduced because every one of these plants has been introduced either accidentally, most of them on purpose, to North America. So let's change the title to Are Introduced Plants Bad? But I've also been taken to task by using the term bad because they say that's judgmental. Well, I'm going to push back on that because good and bad are relative terms. We can measure them without subjectivity. So, for example, let's ask the question, is Doug Tallamy good or bad at basketball? Well, it depends on who you're comparing me to. If you're comparing me to my 3-year-old granddaughter, I'm pretty good. She can't even hold the basketball. But if I go up against LeBron James, I'm not all that good. So we're going to stick with our introduced plants bad. All right, let's start at the beginning, and that is that nature is actually built from many millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants. And this is one right here, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They take those acorns and fly up to a mile, maybe a mile and a half from the parent tree, and they tap them below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where three are, or they only remember where one is. So they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And a single jay can bury 4,500 acorns every fall. Specialized relationship between witch hazel and a group of moths called winter moths. Things like the bicolored sallow, they don't even emerge until the end of October, and they're the primary pollinators of witch hazel, very specialized relationship. You won't have acorn weevils unless you have acorns. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have facilia. Turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We've got between 3,500 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. For example, there's 63 species of native bees in California that will not be there if you don't have pollen from perennial sunflowers. Very specialized relationship between common phlox. It's in our gardens. Phlox varicata and day-flying sphinx moths. They have a very long tongue, and they can get it in that narrow corolla, a corolla that's so narrow that many of our bees cannot pollinate. But you won't have the day-flying sphinx moths, the snowberry clearwing, for example, unless you have their host plant, coral honeysuckle, our native honeysuckle. Point is, specialization in the natural world, particularly focused on food, is the rule rather than the exception, and it always starts with plants. But today, the specialized relationships that form much of nature are threatened by what we call novel ecosystems. That's a term coined by Richard Hobbs. Novel ecosystem is one in which the participants of that ecosystem have not interacted over evolutionary time. So they're just getting to know each other. So the interactions are considered novel. Now, organisms in novel ecosystems haven't had that time to develop those specialized relationships that I just talked about. So the question is, does that matter? And this is the subject that we're debating here. And every once in a while, it pops up even in the New York Times. Maybe invasive species aren't all that bad. We should just leave them alone. It's often costly to try to deal with them. So we really do need to discuss it. But we don't have to argue about it. We can measure whether or not introduced species are good or bad at performing particular ecological roles. And we need to do more of that measuring. So let's ask some questions. Do introduced organisms, those novel species, have a net positive or negative effect on the ecosystem they enter? Not a single positive effect or a single negative effect, but overall, what is the net result of them entering a particular ecosystem? This is a natural area near me. It's actually a park, White Clay Creek State Park. And I took this picture in March when plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. So every bit of green you see in this park there is an invasive species from someplace else, mostly multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive. A lot of non-native plant material there. And the question is, does that matter in terms of ecosystem function? Well, there's some people that claim it does not matter. Plant invasions are not bad. And these are the reasons that have been posited. There's no global extinctions recorded from mainland invasions. Post-invasion species richness is higher. Birds don't care if a berry is native or non-native. Invaded communities are different, but not inappropriate. Introduced plants are here to stay, so we should embrace them. And finally, invasion is just another word for change. It's also been claimed that we don't like introduced plants because of nativism. We'll talk about that. Our response to introduced plants is based as much on aesthetics, morality, and politics as it is on science. And finally, introduced species can provide important benefits to ecosystems. Here's another finally. Returning ecosystems to some mythical pristine state is a fool's errand, and shouldn't there be a statute of limitation on being alien? Let's talk briefly about each one of those statements. But first, Mark Davis, plant ecologist at Macalester College, has written an entire book on invasive species. He says, don't judge a plant by its origins, judge it by its functions. And I agree with that entirely. So if an introduced plant is the ecological equivalent of the native plants, the native species that it's displacing, there should be no impact on ecosystem function. So that's the first question we'll deal with. Do novel ecosystems, the ones that have been invaded by non-native organisms, particularly plants, function as well as co-evolved ecosystems? Well, in order to measure that, we have to be able to measure ecosystem function. And this is where a paper by Robert MacArthur way back in 1955 comes into play. Had a complicated title, but he really said that as you increase diversity in an ecosystem, the number of species in an ecosystem, then ecosystem function and stability goes up. And of course, as you take species away from an ecosystem, then ecosystem function and stability go down. This was armchair ecology. MacArthur, of course, was a brilliant theoretical ecologist. And he died very young, so he did not have a chance to test this hypothesis, but he called it the law of nature anyway. Well, since his death, a number of people have tested it, and in every case, it turns out that he was correct. As you increase the number of species in an ecosystem, it is more productive and it is more stable. And of course, the opposite is true as well. All right, so now we have a way of measuring ecosystem function. We can simply count the number of species in that ecosystem. So the question is, do novel ecosystems contain as many species as co-evolved ecosystems? Well, we've introduced over 3,300 plant species to North America. So you might think, well, of course, we have more species here now, so the ecosystems must be functioning better. The problem is, it's a matter of scale. It depends on where you're measuring ecosystem function. Ecosystems don't function on a continental scale, they function locally. So we need to measure ecosystem impacts locally, and this is where the real impact of plant invasions comes into play, because there are not more species locally after an invasion. This is a porcelain berry invasion. Every plant under this mat of porcelain berry is now dead. This is Cape May, New Jersey. It is a major birding stopover point as birds migrate. Black cherry tree. This is a sweet gum. This is a sassafras tree. And I know that because I crawled in there to look at what's underneath all of this porcelain berry. And of course, all those trees are dead. So the end result is not more species, it's actually fewer species. This is what happens to sagebrush community after cheatgrass invades. It changes the fire regime so that it burns about every 3 or 4 years, and it kills all the sagebrush. So again, species diversity goes way down. Melaleuca invasions in the Everglades, Kogan invasions in the southeast, Phragmites. We can go on and on and on. This is spotted knapweed. This is autumn olive, actually near my house. The end result is that invaded ecosystems typically contain far fewer species than uninvaded ecosystems. And this has been measured a number of times. I stopped citing these papers because I ran out of room. So the local loss of plant species is not something I think we should embrace. And I don't think we should name our names or our roads after these species. And I don't think we should spell it wrong when we do. All right, we have to step back for a second, because maybe the number of species in an ecosystem is not the appropriate metric for ecosystem function. And that message is actually coming from Alexander von Humboldt, who was 100 years ahead of his time. And he basically said, with much of his work, it's not the number of species in an ecosystem that counts, it's how they interact that counts. The diversity of interactions is the key, because nature it's an interconnected entity. It's not a collection of independent species. Dan Jensen, back in 1974, brought this to the fore again with this quote. He was working in Central America, where much of the diversity had been replaced by ranching. And he says, what escapes the eye, however, is a much more insidious kind of extinction. It's the extinction of ecological interactions. So maybe we should be measuring ecological interactions and not simply counting species. So that's the next question. Do introduced plants reduce the number of species interactions in an ecosystem? What's a good measure of interaction diversity? I think food webs is a good measure of interaction diversity. Certainly not the only one, but one where we can start, because food web complexity is really going to determine how many things can actually live there. Excuse me. Well, insect-based food webs have the highest interaction diversity, because you've got a plant, you've got a number of insects eating those plants, and you have a number of things eating those insects. And again, back to Jansen, he says caterpillars are the primary means by which energy is moved from plants to animals. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. He calls caterpillars the meat and potatoes of terrestrial ecosystems. So what do introduced plants do to plant-caterpillar interactions? Well, that's what we've been studying in my lab for almost 20 years now. And one of the very first things we did was to look at caterpillar host plant records in what we called the Mid-Atlantic states. That's how we define the Mid-Atlantic states. And we simply looked at the species of Lepidoptera using native plants and non-native plants. And there's a huge difference. Most of the host plant records are with, if you look at total Lepidoptera, Natives support 90% more Lepidoptera than do non-natives, so huge difference there. What happens to caterpillars when an introduced plant is closely related to the native plant? In other words, when it's a congener. The hypothesis here is that if an insect in North America is adapted to eating a particular plant genus, a native plant genus, but a member of that genus comes in from someplace else, maybe they have the adaptations to use that plant as well. So we set up a large common garden experiment, 5-year experiment, and we measured lots of things. We measured caterpillar abundance, looking at both generalists and specialists. And in both cases, there was a 65% reduction when you compared the native congener with a non-native congener. So they were able to use non-native congeners a little bit, but not nearly as much as we thought they might be able to. Same thing with species richness, a 58% reduction on the non-native congener. What happens when caterpillars are forced to interact with a plant that is not a close relative to native species? Well, then it's an 80% reduction in abundance and a 78% reduction in species richness. That was a common garden experiment where everything was controlled. The location and the fertilization, watering, all even the plant choices were totally controlled. But that's not what plant invasions are. If you walk out into just about any place, you have what we call the thugs taking over. In this case, you've got a lot of autumn olive and multiflora rose and many other things in hedgerows in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Well, what are caterpillars doing in invaded hedgerows like this compared to hedgerows that are not invaded? So this is a simple experiment I did with an undergraduate a few years ago. And the tough part was finding hedgerows that were not invaded, but we did. And in the invaded hedgerows, there was a 68% reduction in the species richness of caterpillars, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars. What about the biomass of those caterpillars? A biomass is a measure of energy flow through that ecosystem. Well, there's a 96% reduction in the biomass of caterpillars in those invaded hedgerows. Now, if caterpillars are bird food, you've just lost 96% of the bird food in these invaded hedgerows. So species interactions certainly are suffering. But what about interaction diversity? We measured that as well, 84% reduction in the interaction richness. And that was simply from one trophic level to the next. We didn't go up a number of trophic levels where interaction richness would have been absolutely clobbered. Why are we having such a reduction in insect herbivores? The answer is that most insects are specialists. They're host plant specialists. About 90% of the insects that eat plants can only develop and reproduce on the particular plants for which they have the adaptations that allow them to get around the defenses of those plants. But for all those adaptations, the specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify compounds, the behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds, takes a long period of evolutionary interactions with a particular plant lineage for all those adaptations to fall into place. And I like to use the monarch butterfly as an example because we know a lot about monarchs. We know that they're specialists on the milkweed lineage. In this country, the genus Asclepias. And we know that milkweeds are protected by cardiac glycosides. Those are nasty tasting compounds that if you eat enough of it, it will stop your heart. Well, it doesn't stop the monarch's heart, and they do have a heart, by the way, because they've got the physiological adaptations that allow them to eat cardiac glycosides without any problem. But what about the sticky latex sap that gives milkweeds its name? You know, when you break open a milkweed leaf, you get a little glob of glue coming out here. And if you get that on your finger, you usually wipe it off right away. But if you don't wipe it off, it gels on exposure to air and becomes like chewing gum. And that's the defensive function of this latex sap. If it's smeared on a caterpillar's mouth parts, it glues the mouth parts shut. So the real question is, how do monarch caterpillars eat milkweed without gluing their mouth parts shut? And this is something you can watch right in your yard, particularly in common milkweed. It's very easy to watch. The caterpillar will walk onto a new leaf, and the first thing it does is go to the end of the leaf and start to eat. And if any latex sap comes out at all, it'll stop eating immediately. turn around, go back up the leaf maybe 2/3 of the way, and then it starts to chew through the midrib. And it chews until it has completely severed the midrib. And what it's done is block the canals that shunt the latex sap from this part of the leaf to this part of the leaf. And this entire part of the leaf now has no latex in it. So it can turn around and go back down, and it can eat the leaf at the base without any latex sac coming out at all. It's a very simple behavioral adaptation, but it's crucial to this caterpillar to be able to eat a plant that is very well defended. And it's also one that most other insects have not discovered yet. Of course, when you chew through the midrib, it flags the leaf. If you're a monarch hunter, you can drive down the road and look for monarchs just simply by looking for flagged leaves. So that's the upside of specialization. The monarch is able to eat a plant that is too toxic for most other insects because it has very specialized adaptations that allow it to do that. The downside is that now that's all it can eat. So by specializing on that one plant lineage, it did not spend any time specializing on other plant lineages. And out of the 2,137 native plant genera found in North America, monarchs could only eat one. And remember, 90% of the insect herbivores that are out there are just like monarchs. They can only eat the plant lineages that they have specialized on over time. But we do have 90 or 10% of the insects that are out there that we call generalists. They can actually use several plant genera. Maybe they're compensating for the loss of specialists. We did an experiment looking at what we consider generalists, like the Luna moth. It's recorded on 25 genera of plants. And what we did was rear it on these were all of the invasive plants that were either at my house or very close to it. And we reared siblings from egg until they died or pupated on all of these plants and compared it with how they did on their native host plant here, which is sweet gum. Well, they did die on all of these non-native plants. They survived a few days on rough-fruited cinquefoil, but then they died as well. So this level of generalization did not enable them to use these invasive plants. Bagworm is a much better generalist. It's recorded, I think, on 87 genera of plants in North America, but we got pretty much the same result. It still died on most of the invasives right away. Survived a little bit on multiflora rose and Bradford pear, a little bit more on Norway maple. None of them made pupation, but this is their native host black cherry, and they did quite well on that. White-marked tussock moth, at the time we did this study, was the most generalized insect we could come up with. Feeds on something like 104 genera of plants. Same result. They survived a little bit better on some of these other plants, but the only one they actually reached maturity on was black cherry. So our most generalized moths are not compensating for the loss of specialists. They can't handle these plants either when you rear them from egg hatch. But it forces us to ask the question, what's a generalist? And to this, we went back to Luna moths, and we reared them on all of the native plant genera on which they are recorded in the literature. So if you go to the literature, it says, they ate a whole bunch of things. Well, we reared them on a whole bunch of things, at least a population that we collected from the eastern shore of Maryland. And it turns out that they were sweet gum specialists. And this has been found with insects that eat eucalyptus in Australia. There's local specialization in insects that we call generalists. So it's just more evidence that our generalists are not compensating for the loss of specialists by being able to use these non-native plants. They can't even use all of their native recorded hosts in one particular area. We're concluding that introduced plants destroy food web interactions, and that's not a good thing. And these are some of the papers that we have published on this subject. But, you don't have to trust us. You can do your own experiment. It's always good to get your own data. I call this my 12 by 12 experiment. That's 12 feet by 12 feet staked out in my yard. You get to decide what's going to live in that area by determining what plants are in that area. You can keep it as lawn, and you can get on your hands and knees and count all the diversity that's in that area on Wednesday. And then, of course, on Saturday, you're going to mow it and kill them all. Or you can put a plant in there. Let's put an oak tree in that space. So this is one I planted from an acorn, by the way, and it covers that 12 by 12 space pretty well. Um, well, we can do just a little experiment at home. Let's count all the caterpillars that we can find on this tree in July, just by walking around. We're not getting a ladder or anything. Walk around, count the caterpillars. Um, so I did July 25th of 2014. I got 410 caterpillars from 19 species on that tree. I did the same thing on black cherry. It covers about the 12 by 12 space there. These are very powerful native plants supporting a lot of species. 239 caterpillars from 14 different species. Now let's go across to my neighbor's yard, where 100% of his plants are non-native, and count the diversity that's on these trees. This is Tallamy Pear, highly invasive tree. Um, First thing I had to do was make sure he wasn't home, so he couldn't see what I was doing. But we counted it the next day. We got one caterpillar, one species, not a lot of diversity there. Then we looked at what was happening on his burning bush. I had a whole row of burning bush. We marked out a 12 by 12 section, counted the caterpillars, got 4 caterpillars from one species, 4 little leaf miners on burning bush. So that is the pattern that you're going to get, but it's one replicate. If you really want to do an experiment, you better do it a whole bunch of replicates, and you can do it as many times as you want. Let's do it again on the next day. Different plants, same species with different plants, and we get the same pattern. 233 caterpillars on white oak from 15 species, 53 caterpillars on black cherry from 10 species, 2 on burning bush, and 1 on Tallamy Pear. So again, you can do this 100 times. That is the pattern you're going to get. Our native plants are supporting a lot more insect diversity than the non-native plants. If you drive across the Bay Bridge, coming north into the Delmarva Peninsula, there is a establishment there called the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill, and these are Tallamy Pears that they have planted there. If you keep driving, the very next property is it's a land conservancy, and it has been thoroughly invaded by the offspring from those Tallamy Pears. Now, you might argue that the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill has the right to plant any plant it wants, but does it have the right to biologically pollute all the land around it with a plant that's not going to support the biological diversity that could be there if they were powerful native plants? So that's why I call invasive plants ecological tumors. They just keep growing. They don't stay where you plant them. Let's look again why insects can't adapt quickly to non-native plants. And people wonder, because they do adapt quickly to insecticide pressure. But there's several things that are going on here. When you spray a field with insecticides, there's typically some resistance in an insect population that is already there. So what you're doing is killing everything that has no resistance, and the resistant ones remain. So the next generation and the next and the next, it doesn't take long before you get a highly resistant population to that insecticide. But remember, the adaptations necessary for that resistance to spread were already in the population. No adaptation necessary. If we're asking an insect to adopt a new host plant, there's lots of things that have to happen, lots of new adaptations for that switch to actually occur. So let's consider all those behaviors. We're going to look at a red-spotted purple. If it's flying around looking for a host plant that it doesn't normally use, it's got to accept that host plant through sensors in its antennae. So we're looking for some mutations in the antennal receptors that would say, okay, land on this plant and accept it as a host plant. So that's it. Genes controlling these antennal receptors have to be modified. They then land on the plant, and they're going to taste it again with receptors that are in their tarsi. So there's cuticular waxes on the leaves, and they're essentially smelling the leaf again for second confirmation that this is a correct plant. So we need changes in those receptors as well. Then we need changes in the receptors on the ovipositor that are tasting the leaf one last time to make sure they are on the right host plant. The red spotted purple will lay an egg right at the end of that cherry leaf. That's where you find them. That egg hatches. The first thing the caterpillar does is eat the eggshell because it's a lot of protein, but then it has to eat this new host plant. Will the receptors in its taste buds accept it as a host plant? And will its physiology be able to handle the phytochemistry that is in this new host plant. So we probably need changes in those parts of the caterpillar as well. That's a lot of changes that have to happen simultaneously for a plant to have an official host switch. Now, host switches do happen, but not very often. Let's look at the monarch butterfly again as an example. We introduced black swallowwort, which is a distant member in the milkweed lineage a long time ago. We introduced it as an ornamental, believe it or not. It's now a serious invasive in the Northeast. And it smells like milkweed. So monarchs are fooled. Their antennal receptors accepted as a host plant. They land on it. Their tarsal receptors accepted as a host plant. Their ovipositor receptors accepted as a host plant, and they actually lay eggs on black swallowwort. But that's where the system breaks down. Black swallowwort, the monarch eggs that hatch on the black swallowwort are not able, the little guys are not able to eat that toxic plant. It's been here since 1854. So after 170 years of opportunity, that final step of monarchs adapting to black swallowwort still hasn't happened. Host switches are difficult. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, you're claiming that it takes thousands of years, if ever, for an insect to adapt to a new host plant." But other entomologists disagree and say they point to several species of butterflies that breed successfully on non-native plants. How do you explain that? Well, I explain that this way. There's two ways that insects use new host plants. One is host switching, and the other is host range expansion. Host switching is really tough, but host range expansion is not. Host range expansion is typically requires no new adaptation. The insect is adapted to the new plant before the plant even got here. Let's use the black swallowtail as an example. It is a specialist on plants in the carrot family, and golden Alexander would be one of its native hosts. So when we introduced Queen Anne's lace and carrots and dill and parsley, the black swallowtails already had all the adaptations necessary to use those plants. So again, it happened right away because no adaptation was actually required. Now, we're not fooling the birds when we create novel ecosystems. I'm taking this data from Desiree Narango's PhD that she did with me a few years ago. She looked at breeding chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and she looked at a number of breeding pairs of chickadees, studied them for 5 years. This is the foraging behavior of a single pair of chickadees. The blue areas are where they did 90% of their foraging, and this was the entire foraging area. That is where the nest was right there. So let's look at what the trees were they were foraging on. Chickadees, by the way, are insectivores that forage on woody plants. Well, they were all the native plants there. They were basswood and sweet gum. American elm was the big one here, black cherry, a couple of species of oaks. Let's also look at the plants that they did not forage on, and they were all the non-native plants in this landscape. Japanese maples and silk tree and ginkgo and crepe myrtles, leyland cypress. So the birds recognize where the food is. It's not that they never go in these trees to forage. It's that they only go once, because when there's nothing there, they're not going to go again. Foraging activity is very, very energetically expensive, and they want to go where they're going to get the biggest payoff. She also measured, I think the number was 70 some species of migrating birds that stopped in her suburban territories. And what they're doing is stopping to rest during their migration. We always say they're resting, but what they're really doing is refueling. If those birds stop in the land of ginkgo, and that's what so many of our yards look like, there are no records of caterpillars no verified records of caterpillars on ginkgo. So there's nothing for them to eat. And if they're food stressed, and they could be if they've just flown 300 miles, that could be the end of their migration. So if you want to help migrating birds, put the plants that are going to make the food that they need for that migration in your yard, and not the plants that won't. Do birds care whether a berry is native or not? Well, birds and berries have co-evolved just like insects and plants have co-evolved. The plants want the berry they want their seed to be dispersed, and they're using birds as dispersal agents. So they cover the seed with a tasty morsel, and the bird eats it and flies away, and then poops out the seed some distance from the parent plant. So if you want your seed dispersed in the summertime, for example, you want to make a berry that is full of carbohydrates, the high in sugar, in other words. The birds have just finished reproducing, mostly on insects. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, which are high in fat and high in protein. So after they're through reproducing, they want carbohydrates. So it's a good way to get your berry dispersed in midsummer is to make them high in sugar. If you want your berry dispersed in the fall, you want to make it high in fat because overwintering birds like the chickadee need fat to make it through the winter, and migrating birds need fat to help them fuel their migration. Near the end of the winter, if you want your seed dispersed just before spring, then you want to make your berry unpalatable through most of the winter, and then it spikes in sugars at the end of the winter. And our native ilex, this is Ilex verticillata, is a good example. The berries freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, and then finally they start tasting good, and the birds all recognize that and come down and eat them right away. So if you actually look at the nutritional differences between invasive berries and native berries, it turns out it's huge. And this work has been done by Susan Smith Pagano. She's continuing to work on it, but she looked at berries of native plants that are producing the berries in the fall and compared them to some of our biggest invasives like multiflora rose and bush honeysuckle and buckthorn and autumn olive and oriental bittersweet. Very high fat in these native berries, very low fat. This is what they need in the non-native berries. These berries are high in sugar, but not high in fat. So she's still working on this, but it's appearing there's a real mismatch between the physiological needs of our birds in the fall and the phenological production of high-fat berries. The non-native berries are producing high sugar in the fall instead of the summer. So do birds care whether the berry is native or not? It turns out they actually do. And when they have a choice, other study by Susan, they will pick the native berry over the non-native berry every single time. In a typical invasion, though, there is no choice because the invasion, picture a bush honeysuckle invasion. That's all there is there. So, of course, the birds do eat those berries. There's nothing else. Okay, if an alien plant supports a particular butterfly, bee, or beetle, is it contributing to ecosystem function? Well, that reasoning considers what is gained from this plant without considering what is lost from that plant. So this, again, is where we need to think of net gain. Let's think about kudzu, which is covering millions of acres in the south. This is the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains, by the way. I can see in 100 years it marching right across taking the whole park with it. Well, it turns out the silver-spotted skipper is a native skipper that it's adapted to feeding on legumes, and it does use kudzu. I took this picture in a rolled up kudzu leaf. So here the kudzu is supporting a native skipper. That's a gain of one species. But what is lost when you have a kudzu invasion? Well, you lose your violets, which means you're losing all of your fritillaries. You lose your milkweed, so you're losing all the things that specialize on milkweed. And it's not just the monarch, it's milkweed tussock moth and several species of beetles and large and small milkweed bugs. They would all be gone. There, large bug. There. All these guys are specialists on beetles. Spicebush supports 11 species of caterpillars. The kudzu could easily overrun spicebush. Greenbrier supports 19 species. Virginia creeper supports 32 species. You would lose all of these species in a kudzu invasion. Sweet gum supports 35 species. Hackberry 43 species. Viburnum 104 species. Goldenrod supports 110 species, and there's no way goldenrod is going to survive a kudzu invasion. Black walnut, 129 species. Elm, 215 species. Maple, 297. And oaks lead the way by supporting 557 species of caterpillars just in the mid-Atlantic states, over 1,000 species nationwide. And small trees like this, any reproduction from oaks is not going to happen when you have a kudzu invasion. And then, of course, all of the birds that rely on all of those caterpillars to rear their young, and it takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to make one nest of baby birds, they're going to suffer as well when you have a kudzu invasion. So you're gaining silver-spotted skipper, but you're losing thousands of other species. This is what I mean when I say we've got to consider the net change in interactions before we judge whether an introduced species is good or bad. Returning ecosystems to some mythical pristine state is a fool's errand. Well, that's not the goal. I mean, there are a lot of people that want to turn the clock back and have it be the way it was, but I know that's not going to happen. What we can do, though, is create ecosystem function by reuniting enough of those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with. It doesn't have to be exactly what was in a particular space at some point in the past. So controlling invasives to the point where you return some ecosystem, some function to your ecosystem is not a fool's errand. Shouldn't there be a statute of limitations on being non-native? Well, you know, we humans, of course, we're non-native to North America too, and that includes indigenous peoples. We've only been here for several thousand years. So people say, you know, if a plant has been here long enough, then it becomes a native, because we, of course, consider ourselves natives now too. Well, an insect or a plant becomes a native when it acts like a native. How do we know what it acts like when it's native? We go to where it came from, where it co-evolved with communities around it. And we could do that with a number of our invasive plants. Things like common reed, Phragmites australis, supports 170 species of insects in Europe, where it came from. After being here 300 plus years, it's actually pushing 400 now. Only 5 species have adapted to Phragmites, and they adapted right away. So this is one of these host range expansion examples. Eucalyptus has been in California in Australia, it supports 48 species. In California, where it's been 120 years, only 1 species using it. Cactus, Opuntia fiscus indica, 16 species in its homeland. No species have adapted to it here, and it's been here 250 years. How about Melaleuca in Florida? In Australia, where it's actually a rare species, it supports 409 species of insects. Only 8 species use it in Florida, where it's highly invasive, and it's been here 130 years. So adaptation does happen. I don't want to pretend that it doesn't, but it takes a long time. And these plants are not acting like up to their native potential, and they're nothing close to the natives that they have pushed out. We don't like introduced plants because of nativism. To me, that's a comical statement. If you go to a nursery, politics as it is on science. The person who said this didn't know much about the science. There's a lot of science out there that says we can judge how well introduced plants are interacting in our ecosystems. So let's revisit all of these things we talked about early on. Plant invasions are not bad. Well, no global extinctions recorded from mainland invasions. There's actually a couple that are imminent. The American bittersweet and red mulberry are hybridizing with Oriental bittersweet and white mulberry, and the end result is through introgression, it's white mulberry and Oriental bittersweet. So any place these plants interact, the native plant is being lost. A notable botanist has told me if I want to find true red mulberry, I've got to go all the way to Texas. It certainly doesn't exist in the Northeast anymore. American bittersweet, you've got to go to Maine to find it because of introgression with Oriental bittersweet. So I think in extinctions, there are many extinctions on islands, by the way. So post-invasion species richness is higher, not if you measure it where ecosystems actually function, and that is locally. It is much lower after a plant invasion. Birds do not care if a berry is native or not. Yes, they do. Invasive communities are different, but not inappropriate. I don't know what that means, so I'm not going to comment. Introduced plants are here to stay, so we should embrace them. You know, cancer's here to stay too, but I don't think we should embrace them. So I'm going to push back on that as well. So wrapping up, are introduced plants bad? Well, they're bad at supporting insects. They're bad at supporting insectivores. They're bad at supporting specialist pollinators, and we didn't even talk about that. About a third of our North American pollinators, we have 35 to 100 to 4,000 species of native pollinators, and a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. And of course, That's not going to be any of these invasives that those insects have never interacted with. They're bad at supporting complex food webs, stable food webs, local diversity, interaction diversity, and ecosystem function. So if we consider ecosystem function, we definitely can say, and I can say it with confidence, that introduced plants are bad. Thank you very much.
Doug, thank you very much for an outstanding talk. It was really excellent.
Great, thanks.
Um, uh, everyone, I think we have some time for some questions. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function, and so we don't to avoid chaos, everybody trying to talk at once here. Or you can type your question in the chat, and I'll be happy to read that out loud.
See, it's wine time. Everybody wants to.
Bye.
No questions.
All right, we got one in the watch party.
Okay.
Teresa, Dennis, go ahead.
Dennis does.
I'm just wondering what Doug thinks is the most detrimental of the invasive species, in his part of the country.
Plant or animal?
Plant.
Yeah, that is a tough question, Dennis. And it changes through time. Right now, porcelain berry. I don't know if you guys have that or not. It's the kudzu of the north, and it grows over everything. It's really terrible. But we also have Japanese stilt grass, which is an annual. I have 10 acres. It is 100% covered with Japanese stilt grass, and without spraying the entire 10 acres, I don't know what to do about it. It grows in the sun. It grows 3-4 feet tall, then lays down, smothers everything. So at least at home, those are my two top bugaboos. Let me say something I didn't include in this talk, and that is the interaction with deer. Deer, of course, prefer our natives, and they don't like the non-natives. I know there's some records of them eating bush honeysuckle and thing, but not to the point where they're actually controlling it very well. And the explosion of non-native plants coincides perfectly with the overabundance of deer. So when we're talking about controlling invasives, we need to think about controlling deer as well, because if you don't, they're going to eat every little native that comes up in a second.
Doug, Steve Motter asks, so the flip side is, are all invasive insects pre-adapted?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Essentially, yes. So the emerald ash borer, for example, is an ash specialist. It is adapted to anything ash can throw at it. It's not a problem in China because the ashes have adapted to it at the same time, but it comes over here. Our ashes have never seen it. So they don't recognize it as a pest until it's too late. They don't have the defenses for that particular. There's nothing when that beetle attacks our ashes, it doesn't elicit a response. So that's a good question. It's the same story with the hemlock woolly adelgid. Gypsy moth or a spongy moth now is actually it's an oak specialist, but when the older instars, they really become generalized. They're big caterpillars and they can eat pretty much everything and just strip that forest. But as first instars, they're oak specialists.
Yeah. In the last month, 6 weeks, we've had spotted lanternflies just explode around here.
Right. Don't worry about that. Well, I'm looking at what's happened here. This is where they were introduced, and all the populations have collapsed. So it's kind of this donut. As they expand out, you've got super high populations, but the center of the invasion has collapsed. Nobody's really sure why. But if that pattern holds, they're going to disappear in a couple of years.
Cool. Well, we'll look forward to that. Tierney asks, what would be the number one perennial you would recommend planting in your backyard to support biodiversity?
Goldenrod.
Mm.
It supports the most specialist bees, about 12 species, 110 species of caterpillar, and all the generalist bees use it as well. And it's also beautiful.
Yeah, it's a charming one. Sam Moore asks, what role do cultivars have in invasive species? Sorry, what role do cultivars have in invasive species ecological dysfunction? Dis in parentheses. For example, native plants cross with non-natives.
Yeah. Some of our very famous invasives like Callery pear, Bradford pear. When it was introduced as a sterile cultivar. Wasn't going to reproduce. Well, then they introduced more than one cultivar Callery pear, and they crossed successfully, and it went crazy. It's claiming the same thing with barberry now, barberry terrible invasive in the Northeast. They say, well, there's a sterile version, and so don't worry. But I've heard this story before, so I don't know. We keep thinking of plants as if they're just decorations. Why do we need cultivars of these decorations? Our native plants are really good at what they do. We can tolerate some ones that have definitely proven to be non-invasive, but
Yeah.
taking an invasive plant and saying this one's sterile, I'm not buying
Yeah. Yeah. Sterile for now.
Yeah.
Amartya asks, does urbanization increase susceptibility to invasion?
Well, disturbance does.
Hmm.
All of these invasive species thrive on disturbance. And of course, wherever we humans go, we disturb everything. And urbanization is the height of disturbance. So I would say yes.
Yeah. George, I see your hand is raised. You can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks. Doc, that was a great talk. It was very illuminating. I've been thinking about there's a lot of publicity being given to
Farmable foods,
I'm sorry.
amphibians.
We lost George.
Go ahead, George.
There's been a lot of attention given to a worldwide decrease in insect populations. And I wonder what proportion of that decrease in insect populations might be due to the ecological phenomena you're describing today.
Yeah. We actually wrote a review paper on that, and we make the argument that it's a lot. The use of non-native plants, whether they're invasive or not, is I mean, that is standard landscaping wherever humans are, and humans are everywhere. So in terms of supporting the food web and supporting insect populations, you've got to have the plants that they're adapted to. So, you can plant ginkgo. It's not invasive at all, but it's not going to support anything either. So we have to think beyond invasiveness to what is the first trophic level in our human-dominated landscapes, and it's about 80% non-native plants. So when you expand that worldwide, I'm sure it's a factor. It's certainly not the only factor, but I think it's an important factor that's been largely ignored.
Let me squeeze one in here, Teresa. Bob Bergstein asks, garden stores sell many plants that insects don't eat. Do you see any way to encourage stores to sell plants that they do eat?
Well, that's one of the problems. Plants have been sold with that, that's a positive feature. They're pest free, meaning nothing's going to use them. And if you're selling plants just as a decoration, that's what you want. You don't want it touched. But if you go out in your yard and you look at the leaves of your plants and nothing has eaten them, it's not contributing to your local food web.
Right.
So I do see this. There are particularly native plant nurseries are putting little signs next to, let's say, next to their oak tree supports 500 caterpillars, and so yes, we're starting to recognize that plants have important ecological functions, and here are these functions because the public doesn't know. So again, if the public is learning that if there's nothing eaten out of their leaves, their plant it's an ecological failure in their yard, and they should look for a plant that's going to contribute. So
Yeah. Teresa or Dennis?
Yeah, this is Dennis. I just wanted to point out that I think ginkgo is going to be coming because we're finding it out away from any planted ginkgo trees
oh really?
in animal dung, and we're seeing the seedlings coming up in woodlots and so forth.
No kidding.
Coyotes love it. We're finding a lot of them in coyote dung.
Huh.
Mhm.
Okay, well, great. I'll take that off my list.
Right.
I'm hearing the same thing about crepe myrtle in the South. Jeez. So everything, you're going through a lag time and they're all doing it. Wow. Jeez.
Yeah. Doug, Ryan asks, if invasive plants are less likely to serve as food sources for native insects, are insect pollinated plants less likely to establish as invasives?
Um, well, what good. I hadn't thought about that. Of course, wind pollinated plants have been pretty successful on this planet as well. Um, I'm having a senior moment drawing a blank here to try to think of examples of invasives that are wind pollinated. Any invasive grass? Well, yeah. How about Japanese stilt grass?
Hmm.
It's wind pollinated and it's doing really well. So, yeah, I'm going to say that they can be equally competitive.
Yeah. Darby says, I'm a parrot researcher, and several species of introduced parrot species in California are endangered or critically endangered in their native range. How do you suggest managing species that are introduced in the U.S. that are endangered in their home range?
That's another tough question. Um, yeah, the starling and the house sparrow are red listed in England now. They're doing real well in the rest of the world, but serious invasive birds there, but they're red listed at home because England has sterilized the island so much. Ah, boy, I don't know. It'd be great to find out what the problem is in their home range and address that. I don't think we need to expand the ranges of these animals that are in trouble in order to save them. We need to figure out what is the problem at home and turn that around. On the other hand, I guess I wouldn't put them top on my list of things I want to eradicate. It's kind of like, we're acting like a zoo where we're holding populations until we can fix the problems at home.
All right, well, we're creeping up on 5 o'clock, so on behalf of the biology department, I would like to give you a huge thank you for your
Well, thanks. Those are really good questions.
excellent talk. Yeah.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Time for that one.